Okay. Thank you everybody for being here. It's 6:05, so we're gonna get started. Thank you all for coming to the Boston University Environmental Student Organization's first ever environmental justice panel. We are so excited to bring this event to our BU community and beyond. I know we have people on the call from all over, other schools, other states, some who are students, some who are members of the public who want to learn more about this topic. So this semester, our club, in the wake of tragedies over the summer, such as the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we decided that we wanted to make environmental justice our main focus because we wanted to learn more about the way race impacts the extent to which different people experience climate disasters and the concerning reality that people of color are more likely to be subjected to dangerous environmental situations. And as we begun to learn more about the subject this semester, we felt a desire to do something a little bit bigger at the end of the semester to sort of further our understanding and hear from the people around us in Boston who work so diligently to help fix these problems. And that's what prompted us to create this panel. So as we hear from our panelists, I'm going to ask that we all type our questions into the chat and keep ourselves muted so that way we won't forget them, but we can also wait until the panelists are finished, and then we'll ask the questions during the Q&A portion. So thank you guys so much. And I think what we'll do also is just have myself introduce myself and have our e-board wave hello. So my name's Keely Bombard. I am a junior at BU. I'm studying environmental analysis and policy. I'm from Rochester, Michigan, and I'm the vice president of ESO.
My name is David Lewis. I am a senior studying history at BU, and I am the treasurer of ESO.
And then if the rest of e-board wants to say hi, introduce yourselves.
I can say hi. My name is Amy Argentar. I am one of the co-presidents of ESO. I'm from Chicago, Illinois, and I am currently majoring in energy and environment in a BA/MA program at BU. So really happy to be here. Thank you, Keely and David, for hosting and moderating and setting everything up. We really appreciate it. And I'm really excited to learn and to listen.
And hi, everybody. I'm Olivia Ruzzi. I am the other co-president of ESO, and thank you all so much for coming. I am from upstate New York, and I study environmental policy and economics, and I'm a senior, and I'm very excited to hear from our speakers and from everyone else with awesome questions, and excited to learn.
Hi, I'm Noah Kunkel-Smith. I'm from Minnesota. I'm co-treasurer here, and yeah, like everyone else, I'm just super jazzed for this panel. It's been like a long process in the making, and I'm just looking forward to hearing our speakers speak.
Hi, how's it going? My name's Gio, and I'm the social media director of ESO. I'm studying economics and political theory here at BU, and I'm from Brooklyn, New York, where I've seen a lot of these environmental disparities, and I'm really interested in hearing what our panelists have to say today. Thank you.
Hi guys, my name is Violet. I am from right outside Yosemite in California. I am currently a junior at BU in a BA/MA program studying environmental analysis and policy. I'm super stoked to be here.
Okay, is that everybody from eBoard? I think so. So we're gonna get right into our questions. The way that it's gonna work is I'll be posing the questions to the panelists, and then each of you, our speakers, will be able to go around and answer them, and sort of popcorn style, whoever wants to go first, and we'll go from there. So the first question is, I would like to ask each of our amazing panelists to introduce themselves. So can each of you tell us your names, a little bit about yourselves, your backgrounds? I know all of you have connections to BU in some way, and maybe explain how you found yourself focusing on environmental justice.
I guess I can start. Hi, my name is Reverend Mariama White-Hammond. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a born and bred Bostonian. Grew up here. I've lived here my whole life except for the 4 years that I went away for undergrad. I'm a graduate of BU STH, the School of Theology. And truthfully, the reason that I was born in Boston is that my mom came to BU as an undergrad in the 60s as part of one of the first large classes of Black students, and large was relative at that time. It's still smaller than where things are now, but and my dad came at the same time to go to Harvard, and they never left. So I was born here, grew up here, and have both seen the power of the universities and the resources that they bring, but I've also lived here and understand the other side of that, and how at times those resources do or do not translate to the other parts of Boston. So I look forward to sharing more about some of that dynamic in the area of environmental justice, and I'm really glad to be with you all this evening.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Belen Power. I was born and raised in Nicaragua, Central America, which has been in the news recently for the last 2 hurricanes that have hit Central America. And so I was raised in the aftermath of the revolution. My parents are from a whole lot of places. That's too long of a story, but ended up in Nicaragua supporting the revolution at the time. And really was raised in a post-revolution, but really rooted in the Jesuit sort of Catholic values of social justice. And came to the US for college. I went to Minneapolis, a small Lutheran school in Minneapolis, and really got involved in the immigrant movement, in the movement to prepare families for the raids, for immigration raids, preparing kids to what should they do if their parents are taken away by ICE. And so that took me to working with immigrant communities. I did some worked at a pro bono law firm for criminal defense for immigrants, and later did some work with day laborers in New York City, in New York, not New York City. But really my roots are the immigrant movement and working with immigrants and workers, immigrant workers in particular, which is what brought me to Chelsea. So I started working in Chelsea in 2011. It'll be 10 years next year. And really started working with immigrant workers, a worker center, wage theft campaigns, and really making sure that immigrant workers' rights were being protected. And that, I used to work at an organization called the Chelsea Collaborative, and was working under this umbrella, this sort of the arm of the immigrant workers, and later transitioned to the environmental justice branch of the Chelsea Collaborative, which was called Green Space. And in 2016, Green Space spun off and became Green Roots. And so, which something that began in 1994 as a grassroots committee is now an independent nonprofit. So for over 25 years, we've been, or I say we, our movement, our organization, and our communities organizing for environmental and climate justice in Chelsea and East Boston. And I can talk a little bit more about those campaigns and our current work, but that's at the root of our work, is really organizing, base building against environmental injustice and climate injustice. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, rest of the panelists, and thank you, Keely, and the ESO board for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me well? Okay, cool. So my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a recent graduate of the BA/MA program at BU, and I studied environmental science with a focus on the geospatial program, as well as the energy policy masters. So that's kind of my focus. I guess how I started doing this work, but really, well, now I guess I'll go back to where I'm from. I'm from California, so completely different than the East Coast. Boston was like brand new for me. I didn't know there could be like a city that's kind of well connected. I mean, LA, I'm from LA, it's huge. It's really hard to get around. So I guess I also passed through Connecticut for a few years, in high school, and then I went to Massachusetts for my university. And growing up in suburbia in California for most of my life, I had no idea. I had never gone to like any forests or anything, and then looking at the Appalachian forest, like the Appalachian Mountains, the Housatonic River, it was just like amazing to me that there was so much. I guess growing up here, we have like local property ordinances, like everything about the wildlife wherever you are. It's like suburbia is always mandated, so it was completely different. Just a different turn for me. And I took an environmental science class, which when I grew up in LA, like environmental science wasn't really a big thing. And on the East Coast, I guess they had a program for that. And it just blew my mind. I didn't know that there were like environmental regulations since the 70s, like that the EPA had put in, like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. And so I was young, I was in high school, and I thought that these were great programs, right? And they are. They just aren't as regulated as much as they need to currently. They just aren't as effective right now, especially with how the EPA is being run. But so I saw that kind of firsthand, but I also that's what inspired me to start focusing a lot of my work in the environment. And so I got to college and I wanted to do environmental engineering. However, they don't have that program at BU. So a lot of my programs involve environmental focuses. And then I just completely switched to the environmental course. And I also got into social justice and environmental justice activism. And that's where I come in with Divest BU. I've been a part of Divest BU for like 4 years now, like my whole entire career, and I still help them out every now and then. And Divest BU is a student activist group on BU's campus that wants BU's administration and their endowment to divest from fossil fuels. So we've been pushing that campaign for 8 years now, and it's still going. And we also pushed a reinvestment proposal so the money can go into our local communities, which a lot of the universities have impacted just by moving in those communities. So that's kind of where everything started and where it's going now. And I worked at some nonprofits, and I realized that my heart is in grassroots organizing, and that I've gone the legal path working for the Department of Energy Resources in Massachusetts and for the EPA Region 1 under the Clean Air Act. And I think that my passion really falls in like when I did work for the Boston Pension Reinvestment Fund. So like we were trying to figure out in I think 2018 how can Boston's pension fund divest from fossil fuels and the prison industrial complex and like guns and the Israeli-Palestinian war. And so, well, that's really where my heart and my work and my creativity thrived, not very much like behind regulations that kind of stifled people in the end and didn't do what they actually needed to do. So that's where I'm at. I mean, I can go in depth a little bit like later, but that's how I got started in this work, and I will continue doing it.
Thank you all so much. Hearing about your backgrounds, I'm just really excited to hear what you have to say, both to the questions that we have for you already and to the audience questions. Yeah, but thank you all again so much for being here, and we'll get into the questions. So the first one is sort of broad, but I find that different people that I talk to about environmental justice, they seem to define it in different ways. So I wanted to ask, what does environmental justice mean to you? Why is it important? How would you explain it to someone who maybe doesn't know what environmental justice is?
I can start. So I think it's important to, instead of defining it, I'm gonna just give you a little context and story. So Chelsea is the smallest city in the Commonwealth, 1.8 square miles, surrounded by water on 3 ways: the Chelsea Creek, the Mill Creek, and the Island End River. And so between Chelsea and East Boston on the Chelsea Creek, we have 100% of the jet fuel that's used at Logan Airport. We have between 70 and 80% of the region's home heating fuel. We have road salt piles that serve over 350 communities in the Northeast. And we have one of the largest produce distribution centers in the country. And so then you look at that and you look at the racial and cultural and economic statistics of our communities. And so Chelsea and East Boston are very similar communities. Chelsea is over 70% identify as a racial or ethnic minority. Over 24% live below the poverty level. And in neighboring East Boston, there are 55,000 residents who live in 5 square miles, although 3 of those are occupied by Logan International Airport. The majority of them are Latino, and about 17% live below the poverty level. So environmental justice, I'm gonna frame it in the way of environmental injustice, which is what we are living in now, and the disparities that we see now, that Chelsea and East Boston are low-income communities of color that are carrying the industrial and environmental burden for the region, for the entire region. So any of us that use road salt on our roads for the winter, any of us that eat produce, any of us that have home heating fuel, any of us that fly in and out of Logan, we're all benefiting from this inequity, including myself and including anybody. So this is about the systems and the structures that are enabling companies and corporations to continue to profit off of the siting of these infrastructure and some fossil fuels, some of other polluting and dangerous infrastructure in communities that have no political power, no political voice, because it's much easier to do that than to do it in communities like Wellesley and Western Mass or any other community that starts with a W that is wealthy and white. So that is really environmental injustice, that we don't have to look far. We don't have to look at Nicaragua and Central America to look at poverty and to look at deep inequality. We are very close to it. We are living it, and we're all benefiting from it. So that, I would say, environmental justice is about the people. And we're actually working right now on a legal definition at the State House, but it's not really about the environment, but it's about the people that are impacted by inequitable distribution of the benefits and the burdens. That's how I would define it.
Bridget, did you want to go? Because I was gonna frame it slightly differently. So go ahead. If
Yeah, I was gonna I'm not frame it. I'll go off of what Maria was saying. I don't think that I introduced my background. I'm a first generation American. My parents immigrated from Ecuador, and so that's me. But so I guess what environmental justice means to me, yeah, when you ask somebody what environmental justice is, they're like anybody off the street. Like it's kind of a difficult topic to grasp, right? Because you think of so many things that should be environmental justice, and then all of the environmental injustices that there are. But I think, like, for me, it's as simple as having access to resources to secure livelihoods, whether that be like wildlife or human populations, and to live safely in a healthy way without any discriminatory environmental laws or regulations or practices within our culture. So that's like a baseline of how that means to me. And then, yeah, I don't really think there is a solid legal definition, which there probably should be. But I also don't, I hope those aren't misinterpreted either way. So yeah, that's just kind of in short what we call it in term EJ, what it means to me. Thank you.
So I think I believe in the importance of the work of environmental justice, and the way I frame my work is ecological justice. And the reason is this. When we talk about the environment, we are usually talking about something external to ourselves. We don't see ourselves as part of the environment. But ecology is the study of relationships between beings that are sharing space together. And for me, the root cause of all of the challenges we're facing is not parts per million in the atmosphere. It's not even like pollution. It's that there's a deep imbalance and unsustainable setup in our system of relationships. And that is in two directions. There is a really huge problem as the only species that knows how to make the levels of distinctions that we come up with to justify treating each other unjustly. No, giraffes don't say like, oh, you have 9 spots and I have 12, like I can't do you. Like no other species functions the way we do, making stupid distinctions about like, there's a river that we put a wall up in front of, and because of that, I have no responsibility or relationship with you, or your hair is a little different, your skin, like no other species functions that way. And we are a deeply dysfunctional species within all of the living beings that are here. And so our dysfunction causes instability in the whole rest of the system. And so for me, it's not like us and the environment. It is, we are the problematic species in a system that we are threatening at a level of collapse. And so we can talk a lot about the problems in our relationships with each other because they're just a hot mess. But then there's also a next layer that I think many of our indigenous traditions have named, which is we also believe we're the only species that matters compared to everyone else. And so we are in relationship with the tiny phytoplankton in the ocean. If they didn't continue to produce oxygen, we would be in serious trouble. We are in relationship with the rivers and streams. Like without water, we would die. We are in relationship with the plants. Without, the work they do to produce oxygen and to clean the soil, and we wouldn't be able to make it. But we reject and we overlook those relationships. We treat all the rest of the creatures poorly. We treat each other poorly. So for me, there is a need to shift. And climate is just a deadline that says, if you don't know how to act, if you don't know how to live right with everyone else, you come up in this house, you poop in the toilet and just leave it, you sleep in everybody else's bed and just destroy it. I mean, you're the worst house guest ever. And at this point, you're putting the very house in jeopardy. And so when people say we're trying to save the planet, no, we're not. She's going to get to a point where she's like, you know what? For my own health and safety, you have got to go. So the planet will survive, but whether or not human beings will be able to survive on the planet is the question. Because at some point, when you're in an abusive relationship, you need to tell them to go. And we are the abuser in this relationship. And we have a little bit of time to get our act together before she says, you know what? If it's me or you, it might need to be you. And so that's the frame that I look at this from. And it plays out in a lot of different ways. So people say to me like, oh my gosh, why are you? I literally just before I got on this call, I was on a call about police reform. Because I don't see these issues as all different. all of them are indicative of bad relationships, ways that we allow power and interactions between us to not be what they're called to be. And I am a faith leader. I'm a pastor. So I do think about this specifically in my tradition. I do call on people to ask ourselves, what is the story from which we draw strength? And how do we understand what God is saying to us about how we need to be? And so, you know, I think the problem is so much bigger. I care about the parts per million in the atmosphere. I pay attention to it. I'm worried that the number keeps ticking up. I care about the pollution and, you know, all of the health challenges that we're facing. And for me, they are all symptoms of a very ridiculous way of being, because it's like, who would pollute water if you need that to live? Like, how does that even make sense? You are like, for us to claim we're rational, we're clearly not rational, because you don't jack up the thing that you need to live. Like, no other species is that foolish. You don't put the future of your species at risk and then say, you know, I hope the next generation will figure it out. Nobody does that but us. And that's the essence of the problem I think that we're in right now. And it plays itself out in so many realms of our lives in so many ways. And I think that 2020, we've just seen it blowing up all around us, from racial uprisings to forest fires to children who still don't know where their parents are and may never. Like, there's all of these things blowing up at the same time, because it's the root cause of the ethos that we live in, and it's dysfunctional relationships. And we got a little bit of time to figure out how to live different, how to be different.
Thank you so much to all three of you. That was amazing. And I think the house metaphor is really such a good way to explain it to people who maybe don't care about the parts per million, like you were saying. It's something that me, as someone who studies environmental policy, I'm like, how come everyone doesn't care about the exact levels of each chemical in the river? How come they don't understand? But somebody who doesn't study this for a living or want to go into this as a career, they see it as, describing it as relationships makes so much sense. And I just think it's a more palatable way to explain it to people who might not really understand what ecology really even is. Because you're right, it's just relationships between living things and how we interact with each other, how we treat each other, and respect. So yeah, thank you all so much. The next question is sort of more about actual projects that you guys have worked on or issues. So could you guys tell us about a project or an issue that you worked on related to environmental policy, environmental justice, and how did that play out? How did it get resolved, if it did get resolved? And if it didn't, what's the current status?
I feel like we're going in rounds. I'll take it. So I guess first I'll say that, you know, Massachusetts, despite its progressive reputation when it comes to public health and environmental justice, has one of the most profound race and class disparities. In 2016, the Center for Effective Government graded Massachusetts and only one other state an F for exposing low-income people and people of color and people that live below the poverty level to hazardous facilities. So I'll tell you two quick stories. One story is from a few years ago, and then another one is right now. And so in 2006, actually it was 2007 or 8. I don't know if you can raise your hand, but how many of you have heard of Cape Wind? Cape Wind, okay, some hands. So it was the very same proponent, this Cape Wind, was proposing clean air for Nantucket. And that very same proponent was planning a dirty diesel power plant for the banks of the Chelsea Creek and across the street, our only elementary school complex. So when Green Roots got wind of that proposal, we immediately mobilized, organized, and used every single tactic in the organizer's playbook. We mobilized, we wrote letters, we testified, we intervened in legal procedures, and we protested. And eventually we were successful in defeating that proposal. And so there is no power plant right now in Chelsea. And so children like my own can play in that playground right now without breathing in those fumes. So right now we're in a similar struggle. There is a substation that is being proposed again on the banks of the Chelsea Creek, but on the other side in East Boston. And so this substation is an electrical substation that's being proposed for the banks of the Chelsea Creek by Eversource. And it's projected to go next to 8 million gallons of jet fuel, adjacent to a heavily utilized playground, in a neighborhood that is densely populated, immigrant, low income, non-English speaking. And the process was pre-approved tentatively during a hearing that Reverend Mariama was at in 2017, where interpretation was requested ahead of time, but they thought it would be too disruptive to interpret for residents who wanted to hear about this project. So the whole thing happened, and for 4 hours that residents from that neighborhood took time out of their day and sat there listening to this legal wonky procedure in English. They understood nothing. And so now, even in the midst of COVID, in the midst of a pandemic, East Boston being the hardest hit neighborhood of the city of Boston, with some of the highest rates of unemployment, of COVID infection, of eviction, of homelessness, Eversource is shoving this process through again, and they're planning a Zoom hearing for December, right before the holidays. So this is happening right now in front of our eyes, right as we're having this conversation. Eversource just submitted something tonight to the Energy Facility Siting Board from the Conservation Commission of Boston to get their final permit. And so on December 16th, the Energy Facility Siting Board, which is chaired by Secretary Theoharides, Climate Katie, I like to call her because it's easier than her last name. That's her Twitter tag, I think, Climate Katie. She, the chair of the EFSB, is moving forward with a hearing on Zoom for folks in East Boston who are barely able to make ends meet, who don't have internet connection, who don't have multiple devices, who are facing eviction, food insecurity. There are lines and lines of people getting food. It is absolutely shameful that the governor, the secretary, the Energy Facility Siting Board, and Eversource is proposing a ticking time bomb for this neighborhood. And they're doing it because it's an immigrant community, non-English speaking, because people don't care. They do not care about Black, brown, and immigrant lives. The folks in power simply don't. It is shameful that Climate Katie says she cares about environmental justice and climate justice, that the governor says he cares about communities that have been impacted by COVID, and he hasn't stepped foot in East Boston and Chelsea. Throughout the whole pandemic, the governor is all over the Commonwealth, except Chelsea and East Boston. So it is shameful that this is happening, and this is the kind of projects that this is our bread and butter. We've been organizing against this substation for years. This hearing that I mentioned earlier happened in 2017, 3 years ago. So that's our current campaign. We're organizing, we're mobilizing. We just heard about this hearing, the final hearing being scheduled last Friday, that it's gonna happen right before the holidays via Zoom. And so what we're calling is for the hearing to get postponed until it is safe to meet in person, and it is safe for people to engage in a meaningful way, and for the Energy Facility Siting Board at Eversource not to just check the box and say, well, we had a hearing. and I'll end it because I can keep going for hours about this.
So I can talk about another project, energy-based. I did want to talk about my food project, but that's a side note. Maybe we'll have some other time to talk about that. Food justice is probably what I'm working on the most right now. Started a farm with some friends. So anyway, that's a side note. I think so now I am pastoring my own church. We're just turned 2 years old. But before I was here, I was a minister at the church that I grew up at. And, we were trying to figure out, the church has a humongous roof. And we were we should be able to put up some solar. Let's figure out how to do this. And what we found was that it wasn't quite as easy as we thought. In particular, because the question was how do you finance it? And it's worth noting that, many congregations, I know a number of sort of Unitarian congregations, Jewish synagogues, a couple of UCC churches that I know were all able to finance their solar using their endowment. They had, money that had been set aside, often been donated, often when people passed away, to the congregation, and they were able to use that to finance their solar projects. But if you are an organization that doesn't have an endowment, a lot of times it has been hard for folks to be able to figure out how to participate in solar. And so we were trying to figure out what could be this long-term fundraising campaign. And what happened is, in 2016, we found out that there was another congregation also trying to figure this out, that they too wanted to do solar, and they too have the same thing, that they didn't have a chunk of $100,000 just sitting around that they could just be oh, we'll just use this to invest in solar and sort of pay that fund back. And so we came together in what became the Interfaith Solar Project to sort of figure out how could we use the fact that we had these massive roofs. And our goal was not just to fund and to be able to power our congregations, but to produce enough power to be able to give power away for free or at a much lower price to low-income folks in our surrounding community. We knew that people at times were struggling to pay their bills, and said, why not put enough panels up here, not just to help the congregation, but to help other folks who would like access to renewable energy. But if you're a renter, how are you gonna get access? And so it was basically part for the church and part for community shared solar. So we were excited, we were moving the plan along. And in the middle of it in 2016, there was a new solar bill passed at the State House. Now, what I do believe, to be honest with you, I think some legislators read some of it. I think that there were some sections that the utilities just wrote and they just put them in there, because when I talked to them, none of them actually even knew what was in there. But that's another conversation we could have later about the efficacy of the Massachusetts State House. But anyway, so in the middle of our project, we'd lined everything up. We had these groups, we were ready to go. And this bill gutted the financing for the project, because it basically changed what kind of subsidies we were eligible, and changed it so that we couldn't do the extra array that would have allowed us to give or sell power at a reduced rate. And so two things that we did. First of all, we were we are not giving up on this. We've come so far. And so we figured out how to make our project keep going despite that. But what we had to let go of was the ability to do the community shared solar, because we couldn't get zoned for it anymore the way that the bill was written. And so we were we're going forward, but we were smart about it. We invited our elected officials to the groundbreaking. And we celebrated. We were this is so great. And now we'd like to talk about why our project almost got gutted in the middle. And we broke down for people why the change in policy meant that low-income communities, folks who were serious about shared solar, why so many people would be locked out because of these changes. And the truth is, one of the state reps who was there was like, wow, when I voted on that, I didn't realize the impact that it would have on our community. In his mind, and it's true for many people, overwhelmingly the solar subsidies that Massachusetts has have gone to wealthier, whiter communities. And that is because many of the solar companies want to do the easiest projects. And the easiest projects are a single family home where you own the land around you. And if you want to cut down a tree, it's totally up to you, because then they can come in, do it. These people don't need nearly as much financing. So you don't have to work with, you don't have to do all this extra work. And so those are the projects that have been moving fast. But the people that are really struggling to pay their bills, who might live in triple deckers, right? Like in my neighborhood in Dorchester, most of us live in triple deckers. That means that you have to negotiate with 3 different people. Maybe you have to talk to a landlord. My house is right up against the house next to me, right? And so all of those things mean that the projects are just a little bit more complicated. And it means that those solar companies don't even come to our neighborhoods, don't even try, because they're not necessarily interested. And so out of that project, actually, the folks that helped us work on that project then ended up becoming their own solar company who focuses on doing these kinds of challenging projects. Their name is Resonant Energy. And we started working together. We wrote a bill, which is we're still trying to get that passed. That's a whole nother thing, how dysfunctional the state house is. But we started getting active. The church members started showing up at, regulatory hearings. And it was funny because when you say things like, you almost prevented our church from like helping poor people, it was a very different frame. Like they hadn't thought about it that way. They were surprised to have people showing up, really holding them to account for the impacts of those policies. And I think a big part of the problem is they don't think about who's going to lose when a lot of these policies are made. Right. And what I would like us to do is not just try not to hurt people. When we're doing policies, we should be asking ourselves, what communities are already struggling? What communities need a leg up? How could we be using these policies to make sure that our low-income communities actually have more jobs? How could we use these policies to make sure that people who are struggling to pay their bills can not only pay their bills, but are paying for the God-given energy of the sun and the wind? How could we be thinking radically differently? And so, a lot of it is not just about pushing back on what they're not doing right, but really trying to frame for them. And so that the work that came out of that one piece has continued engagement around solar legislation. It introduced us to the Department of Public Utilities, which is the same group that Maria Belen was talking about. They are not the Department of Public Utilities. They call themselves the DPU, but they're just the DU, the Department of Utilities. I think they should take the P out, since they forget us most of the time. It's just, insulting for them to keep the name in there. And I try to remind them that the P is supposed to come before the U. But it's going to take a while to shift their mentality and help them to understand that. So I think, it is a powerful story. Those solar panels are up there. I'll put a video in the chat that you can see. But what's even more powerful is that a series of people were activated to get more serious, not just about what our church could experience, but what should be available for congregations and nonprofits and affordable housing developments and multifamily housing all across the state. We should be making sure that if we have subsidies, they're going first to the people who need it the most. I don't have any problem with Wellesley getting subsidized. What I do have a problem with is you give all the subsidies to Wellesley and then you cut them off just before Roxbury can get anything from that. And again, we really have to look at where is the money going and how are we creating policies that make sure that we're getting double, triple benefit from it. People get clean energy and they can feed their families because they're spending less on the bill. And those feel like smarter, stronger policies. And that's what that experience of things not exactly working out like we wanted to, has gotten us much more deeply in the fight around how we set ourselves up not to choose between the economy or the environment, but something that is both economic justice and climate justice at the same time.
Thank you. Yeah, very well said. I guess to kind of follow up, but no. So the question was like an issue that I worked on and like how to walk through it, right? So I guess I've dipped my feet in a lot of environmental and social justice issues, and the ones that I think really stand out to me, I'll just quickly go over them. But so this year I worked on mostly it's like community work. It was for, I don't know if any of you guys have heard of integrated pest management. It's called IPM. And that is like a big thing that's up and coming. It's actually been a thing since like I think the 80s or 70s, but yeah, thank you. So the state of Massachusetts had, I think they have what they call like vendor contracts, and they basically have a state ordered, here are the people that you can buy from for the service of IPM. And the service of IPM is essentially to make getting rid of pests or applying pesticides. Yeah, it's a service to make it like cleaner or safer for the people in the area. So what we really found that was school children were heavily affected, and in areas like environmental justice communities or farming areas, especially in California, we have a lot of like acres and acres of farms, and especially strawberries need a lot of pesticides. And we find, and we're in a desert, so all of that combined is just really bad air quality. Basically like that, it's a problem in every state, but in that specific place, they found that people in California, by those strawberry fields, they found that they had a lot higher rates of asthma in children in general. Even in New York City, they found when they did a study on the pesticides they use within the classrooms, they had a lot higher rates of asthma, like in the inner city. And so that was a project that I was working on with my environmental law professor. And we basically wrote a report to send to the Massachusetts Secretary of Education, because they are coming up with new IPM contracts for the vendors. And we find that there are instances of people falsely advertising IPM, and those are currently being sued. Like True Green is currently being sued by the EPA, and I think another pesticide like anti-pesticide organization, for falsely advertising their material as being IPM, when in reality it's just another set of chemicals that aren't like easily identified. And so, or the workers aren't trained, under like OSHA statutes, which is the Occupational Safety Health, yeah.
It's administration.
Administration. I was like thinking it, but then I was like, maybe it's something else. But yeah. Oh, thanks, Rick. Oh, that's actually my law professor here, Richard Racine. Yeah, so basically we're hoping that with this research we can get a move on ahead with the I want to say awareness of the problem in schools, and what is out there, what can we do next. And then another thing that I really like took to heart was under this, I was also working like with a side project on lead in housing communities. So especially how I thought was really interesting and deeply disturbing was the like discrimination against families in like renting or owning houses. In Massachusetts, they have I think it's they call it like shorthand the lead law, and it protects children, specifically children, from the harmful effects of lead. Essentially, like owners or like the landlords have to disclose if there is like any levels of lead, or if there's lead in the house, in the walls, and the paint. And so there's like a kind of, I guess they take advantage of that in the sense where that if they don't have children, the family doesn't have children, they don't essentially have to disclose the law. And so that helps them, rent, that they're found that they have discriminated against people that have children, and so it's in essence families in Massachusetts. And so I don't know what the work is going through that, but I know that revising the lead law is necessary against this discrimination. And then I guess like apart from that work was I guess would go through like energy, right? I do a lot of divestment work, and that's essentially fossil fuel divestment. So over the summer, I worked at Divest Ed, which is a nonprofit, and we work to train college age or even high school age students to support fossil fuel divestment campaigns within their university or communities. And we focus on mostly trying to reach out to people of color or communities of color that have historically had like problems in their institutions not being able to have a voice and speak out. And so we provide resources, and we bring on speakers like the Reverend or Maria, and we do outreach to try to get people to develop these skills of public speaking, of being aware and unafraid of saying what's wrong and what's in your heart and what you believe in, and making that crucial like community care and social change, and like bringing those ideas together, and like rooting out anti-Blackness and have that white-centric view of environmentalism. And so that's basically, that kind of came from my work at Divest BU, which for 4 years I worked pretty hard to get the attention of BU's administration and their board of trustees to get fossil fuels out of our endowment, because BU prides itself on being like one of the most environmentally friendly campuses in the U.S. And so if they pride themselves on that, why can't, apart from investing in solar credits and a whole like wind farm to get us to a BU climate action plan, which I also work to support, why can't they try to take advantage of a new, I guess. So basically the board of trustees reasoning for not divesting is that there hasn't been enough of a change in the world to justify divesting from fossil fuels. And so our goal as a group, as a big Divest BU, was to try to tell them, like through the IPCC, through their stocks, like through the history of thanks, Kai. They're like the I guess oil history, trying to figure out that things have changed, that universities are divesting and they're pledging to divest. And even though BU has said that they will divest from coal and tar sands as they see fit, again, as they see fit, as they can, they always go like, our money is in commingled funds. That's basically what they just want to like go say is a black box. We can't really touch it. We don't know where the money's going. And that kind of brings you to the point where all of these big institutions and these large corporations have so much money that they invest in that a lot of them don't know where it's going. the city of Boston, when I went to the pension fund hearing, the city councilor, Michelle Wu herself, said, like after the hearing, because they were asking the managers, the fund managers, where is our money going in front of the public in the public hearing. And she she, after the meeting, she said, well, it's obvious that we don't really know where our money is going. The fund managers can't even really tell us where the money is going. And so a year later, in 2019, the city council board endorsed putting fossil fuel divestment, having that option in the pension fund for the retirement board. So I think that was a great first step, and I'm really proud to be a part of that in the small way I was. But I'm really glad to have supported that. And then I guess that brings me to like my work with other communities. So with All in Energy, they are a small nonprofit, and they want to basically help bring Mass Save to all of Massachusetts. And Mass Save is basically a program that helps you save energy on your bills if you have like Eversource, National Grid, all those big ones. They have like a way for you to save your money as well as get resources that help cut costs. So like they will literally deliver like low cost light bulbs or whatever, and it's already a tax that people in Massachusetts pay, and they don't really understand. So like I myself had gone out and canvassed and shown people if they have Eversource, National Grid, or any of the major electricity companies. I'm like, here's the bill. It's like it's called the Mass Save tax, and you get taxed on it every month or when you pay the bills. And that money is specifically so that you can get this benefit. But a lot of people don't, they don't know that that is a benefit. They just think it's another tax that the state puts on them. But you can actually gain that benefit. And so the laws have changed. I think most recently it's a different way to, I think they're just mailing resources now, like they aren't actually, but they're doing also free energy audits of homes. And so it kind of like changes between if you're if you're a renter or a homeowner. But we saw that specifically All in Energy wanted to work in communities like Dorchester and Roxbury, which are predominantly Black communities, and some Latino communities up in like, I forget where they were. But yeah, so we focused a lot on reaching those communities. Cool, thank you. Reaching those communities. And I was really proud to be a part of that work. And it's still going today, and you see like a lot of community building and, building that trust, because there are a lot of third energy providers that mask themselves as like being helpful, and they're not, they're predatory, especially towards communities of color, and taking advantage of that. And so we pride ourselves on, we're not a third provider. We don't take your money at all. That's not what we do. The way that this nonprofit got paid was they had like an agreement with the state or with the local city councilors. And this city, like the city of Cambridge, also endorsed, they had a contract in order to be able to reach the residents. And then that's also when we incorporated solar, the community solar in Cambridge. So we also outreached for the community solar project in Cambridge, which was great. And so yeah, that kind of all started from my work at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. I knew that there was such thing as Mass Save. Like my neighbor, he's in the next cubby over me in the office, worked on Mass Save, and I just worked on like a separate Clean Cities. That's a coalition basically focusing on the vehicle infrastructure in Massachusetts, so trying to get transportation emissions down. And a really interesting project we were working on was electric school buses. So they picked a few programs and a few counties in Massachusetts to bring these buses to. And so I looked at the data and how it was helping. But the project was going well, and I think it's still a pilot project. So I'm hoping for the best for that. Yeah, and then to wrap it up, I think that the Divest BU, that plan is still working, and I'm still supporting the current numbers. And I really hope that we can get the money to be reinvested in our local communities. We also proposed a reinvestment fund, and a pretty good example is the Ujima project in Boston. And so that's a community fund that focuses on giving money to the community businesses and kind of going full circle. And so we really hope to see this implemented. Yeah, through DivestBU, we also brought a lot of speakers in the community about how these environmental injustices affected them. So one of them was like the incinerator in Saugus, right? We had somebody from Clean Water Action, which is a nonprofit, come and speak to BU students about what's going on in with the waste incinerators. So Massachusetts, apart from Connecticut, is the largest, like one of the largest trash incinerating states in the US. So it's like Connecticut, Massachusetts, and then it just goes down. So we burn a lot of trash here, which means that a lot of our residents breathe in this particulate matter, and it's very bad for us. And these are poorly regulated. You know, like my time working with the EPA, I heard about how people went and inspected these incinerators, and honestly, it didn't make me feel very confident in the jobs that we were doing and the work that we were doing. And I hope that it'll get better with the new administration. But it's very lax, I would say, lacking. And a part of that would also be, I guess, the Weymouth compressor station. So I guess, yeah, it's like a big name in BU. And also Nathan Phillips done work with that. So I guess to top it all off, there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm so glad to have been involved in these projects. And all of you guys at BU, like this isn't stopping. Like this is work that is still happening today, that you can still go out and be involved in today. So, you know, like try to contact your local rep or whoever these the heads of these orgs are, like Clean Water Action, and do your reading, and it'll be there. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. I think it's so interesting to hear about the actual projects that are going on. And I think what struck me is, I don't know, I just kept thinking about resiliency. And I feel like we talk about resiliency in electricity, we talk about it in the technical sense. And what you guys are talking about with your work is resiliency in the human sense. With Maria, the Reverend, Bridget, you've all done work it's not just that you find the answer and then it stops. You hit roadblocks and you have to push past them, and you have to continue doing work. Like Bridget, you've worked with Divest throughout college and now past college. Like it doesn't end. It's not something that you find the answer for. It's an ongoing challenge. And so it's interesting to hear about the things that are going on now and the things that have happened in the past. I also just want to remind everybody listening that if you have any questions for our speakers, put them in the chat and we will ask them after the Q&A portion. We have just a couple more questions for you guys before we get to audience questions. So thank you all so much again. So this next one sort of, I think that we've been dancing around this the whole time, and that's what are the key challenges of this work? How have you guys overcome them in the past? And another portion of this question is how could local, state, federal policy help to mitigate those challenges? Mariama, this is your time to talk about the State House. Yeah, so I just think it's important to think about, I know a lot of people in the chat have been asking, like, how can we get involved? How can we help? And I think it's also important to think about how our institutions can do better to support the work that you guys are doing.
Yeah, so I think there's change to be made on a lot of levels, but since I've been talking about the legislature, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about them. So I want to name that the big picture of it is that our legislature doesn't do very much. They do not pass very many bills. They feel like really excited if they like pass like 6 bills in the like budget. It's just completely unacceptable. So I just want to name that big context that they don't move on things. And part of the big challenge is the way it's set up. So many more things get done in the Senate than get done in the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives is controlled by the Speaker of the House. And I mean, when I say controlled, I mean controlled with an iron fist. And so like, there's no debate, like things come to the floor and you're like, I don't know what happened. Things get sent to committees to die. There's a lot of dysfunction in the way that it works. And I think like, I just need to name, we need to overturn how that legislature functions, because I don't believe you're ever going to get super productive, innovative legislation out of a body that is as dysfunctional as ours is. So I just need to start from that frame. And some of what I think helps people change is when they start losing their seats. Like, if you can keep your job performing poorly, why would you change? Until we start holding people to a higher level of performance, I'm not sure that they're gonna shift. So that's the big picture, like, piece. I think the other thing that's frustrating about the work is we have, and this is shifting slightly, but still a challenge. You have the environmental people over here and the like economic, racial justice people over here, and they're not often the same people. Sometimes even when they are the same people, they're not bringing the ideas from one group into the other. We're not asking like, oh, okay, well, this is an economic justice bill. How could we put some of the money towards green jobs? We are not asking, this is an environmental bill. How do we make sure that the resources go to the people who need it the most? They're far too often, the environmental bills are over here and the racial and economic justice bills are over here. And we need to stop that. Both Maria Belen and I are part of a group called the Green Justice Coalition. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is really push people on that, specifically environmental people on that, because they'll come to us and they'll be like, we want you to endorse these bills. And we're like, where's the equity? Have you done the work? We actually have a tool, an equity tool, where we're like, before you ask us to basically do your work, here's the like 20 questions laid out in some subsections for you to ask about your own bill before you show up to us and ask us to endorse it. Have you looked at where the resources are going? Are you thinking about making sure that it's going to small businesses, minority businesses, female business? Are you even, did you ask any of those questions? Or were you just like, it's gonna lower carbon emissions? Like, that's not sufficient in the thinking. And so one of the reasons, and I hope where this message is getting through, I feel like we're making more progress, is that to really shift on climate change, to really get people to move in a powerful way, we need to bring together the most amazing coalition of folks ever, which means everybody has to see themselves in what we're putting out. How are we thinking about the communities that have been left behind? If we're gonna shut this power plant down, how are we making sure that the people that worked at that plant are going to have a job in the next thing that we're putting out? And we have not often done that kind of thinking. And so you get all the environmental diehards, and that's it. And we've gotta be more creative than that. We've got to do better. Not just because it's the right thing to do. I would like us to do it just because it's the right thing to do. But it's also the more strategic and effective thing to do. I give the example of a good friend of mine who organizes in Chicago, and they were moving on their energy efficiency piece. They were basically creating something similar to Mass Save. But here's what they did. They focused on the jobs that would be created with energy efficiency. And they gave first dibs on those jobs to young people aging out of foster care. Why? Because being in foster care and not having a good age out process is the highest correlation with becoming incarcerated. Highest. Actually, just being in foster care overall is the highest correlation. But if you can help a young person age out of foster care in a good way, get into college, connect with a family member who will support them, find a job, they will not end up locked up. And so by saying we're going to train a core of people, starting with young people aging out of foster care, now you had all the environmental people who wanted to reduce emissions. You had energy advocates who were like, we're glad that people's bills are going to go down. You had child welfare advocates showing up and advocating for this bill. And you had formerly incarcerated people who were like, we don't want anybody else to get locked up. That was a coalition that you never see. And so they're going into people's offices and people are like, wait, who are these people? They're people from across the state. They're people from the suburbs and the city also working together. They're faith people and like business people and like young people just got out of lockup. We're not used to seeing that. Those are the kinds of powerful coalitions that we can do if we're not narrow in our thinking. And then whatever money you put into it is paying off in multiple ways. It's keeping young people out of prison. It's helping them get good jobs rather than, just recruiting people from other parts of the country or other parts of the world. It's helping lower people's bills. It's lowering your carbon footprint. You got all these different benefits out of one bill. We haven't quite gotten there yet in Massachusetts. But I do hear now among advocates more awareness of the need to be creative. We just need to get better at making the rubber hit the road. And so Maria Belen and I are also part of the Green New Deal table that's literally looking at how do we help that to happen. And an example of something we're working on right now is a food policy that I'm hoping that folks will vote on it, and I hope we can move it through the legislature. There's a lot of work to make this food policy work. But the idea behind it is, recently we saw how many people were struggling to eat. Still, people are struggling to eat. 90% of the food in Massachusetts comes from outside of the state. That means that if something falls apart in Iowa or California or Florida, we are screwed. It is much safer for our state if more of our food comes locally. And so what do we need to do to make that happen is we need to support our farms. But we also need to make sure, because y'all have been to the farmer's market, the farmer's market is much more expensive than Stop and Shop. It's just true. Most of the time it is. So we also have a program called HIP, Healthy Incentives Program, which right now says if you receive SNAP benefits, food stamps, you can get these vouchers that allow you, for every dollar you spend from your benefits, you get an extra $1. So it basically cuts anything you buy at the farmer's market in half. It half prices it. So now farmers have a reason to grow more because more people can afford their food. We make sure that more of our food comes right here locally and is not being trucked, flown, driven all across the country to get here. And we're making sure that our vulnerable communities like Chelsea, like East Boston, like Dorchester, like Fall River, where folks are experiencing COVID, are actually getting access, not just to any old food, but healthy food that's gonna do the best it can to help people be safe and strong. These are the kinds of policies we can put together that reduce emissions, that make people healthier, and that make our economy stronger. And so that's an example of something we're trying to introduce in this next legislative cycle, where we look at what are the multiple bottom lines. And we're saying for those farmers, because it includes a farm corps where we would actually pay people through the state to work at local farms, but gotta pay people a living wage. Can't have people working and making so little they can't afford the food that you're selling. So how do we look at bringing multiple policies together in ways that are creative and solve more than one issue? And I think if for those of us particularly who work on climate, we're like, why don't people care? How do they not get it? Let's start making it really easy for people to care. Let's start making it so that people think, when I advocate for climate, I'm advocating to be able to feed my family. When I advocate for climate, I'm advocating so my child can run outside without wheezing. We can do things that bring multiple pieces together and be much more successful. And I do see us shifting. I see it getting better. Still have a ways to go.
I can talk a little bit about some similar stuff. Reverend Mariama and I overlap a lot. We work together on a lot of different initiatives, so I'll try to not repeat myself. One table that she didn't mention, there's a lot of tables and a lot of coalitions, too many. So one coalition that Reverend Mariama didn't mention is the Environmental Justice Legislative Table. And so between Neighbor to Neighbor, Andrea is the new co-executive director, and myself, we've been convening the Massachusetts Environmental Justice Legislation Table. And it came together almost 2 years ago. And we've been pushing this legislative session, which, again, like Reverend Mariama said, very, very slow. It should have ended in July. Of course, COVID, I understand, but still, they move really slow. So this is the furthest that EJ legislation has ever gone, which is, again, shameful that we meaning Green Roots and our allies have been pushing for environmental justice legislation for over 20 years and have gotten nowhere. We have EJ policies that the state has enacted that Governor Patrick signed like a couple of weeks before he left office after being in power for a little bit of time. So there's been very little movement on the legislative part around environmental justice. And let me just say that the environmental justice legislation is also not groundbreaking. It's not the most like amazing and significant thing in the world that we could ever ask for. It is literally defining a population that needs more protections and that should have more resources to protect the community. And so, a definition that's used widely across the country and the world is race, income, and language. And so it is using data, population data, to say this percentage identifies as a community of color, this percentage is below the poverty level, and this percentage is non-English speaking or is experiencing language isolation. And it seems pretty basic, 3 criteria. There's actually 4, because one of them combines income and race to just capture other communities that should be considered EJ, but they're not. And so, again, pretty basic: income, race, and language. If a community meets that threshold, they should be protected more. They should have more resources to protect themselves, their environment. But really, it's also about the permitting process, that there should be further review in the permitting process. So again, the substation of East Boston should have gone through a deeper dive and a further review before approving it. Why? Because of the cumulative impact. There are so many burdens in East Boston. Like I said, jet fuel, home heating fuel, road salt, airport parking, related parking that's lining the waterfront, industrial storage. There is just an incredible amount of industrial and environmental burden in that community that, yes, there should be further review. There should be a deeper dive before you approve yet another polluting or dangerous infrastructure in that neighborhood. And even though it seems pretty basic, there are some legislators, and I will say a senator in particular, who doesn't think that race should be considered in the definition. That race has nothing to do. That race should not be considered as a criterion because it has nothing to do with environmental justice, even though the environmental justice movement grew out of the civil rights movement, out of Black and brown communities bearing a larger burden for a lot of things, including pollution and death. And so something that seems very basic to us is obviously still not, doesn't seem true to very progressive Massachusetts legislators that talk a whole lot of talk about justice and about equity and about COVID and all of the disparities that have been uncovered by the pandemic. But when it comes time to act, there is very little political will, little. And so I'll say that in terms of, so right now, the language for environmental justice, again, it's the furthest it's ever been. It's in conference committee. So call your senators, call your legislators, and say that you care about environmental justice. I can also share more information later, but there are the conference committee, there are members of the House and the Senate. And so those members are the ones that will be deciding whether or not this gets reported out favorably. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I'll say about the political will and political sort of motives is a lot of times our challenges come from our very own allies, the environmental allies, who, it's very easy to talk about equity and Black Lives Matter. It's easy to put up a sign outside of your house, to go to a rally, and to bring your family. That's easy. What's hard is using your connections and your relationships with people in power to make change. And so that seems to be a very difficult place where it is always grassroots organizations, environmental justice communities, low-income people, people of color, people who don't speak English, who again and again and again have to put themselves on the line to defend their humanity, to defend their existence. So when we ask allies to put themselves on the line for us, a lot of times it's not so easy and not so obvious because, it's sort of easy to be in relationship with power. It's nice. It's nice to have a connection with the secretary and with the governor and with executives. So I would say that's a big challenge for us. And I think that translates into the other challenge that I was going to mention, which is power. It's power and money. At the end of the day, it's all about power and money and connections. We talk about our work about we're fighting the bad and we're building the new. And so we're building an electrical microgrid, a community microgrid in Chelsea. And in building that microgrid, we're going to need a lot of money. I mean, a lot of investment. And so that's where the barrier comes, where that's exactly why when we talk about energy efficiency, when we talk about solar panels, that's why it's easier for wealthy folks to be more environmentally friendly, to have solar panels, to have battery storage. But when it comes down to it, communities of color and low-income communities, we just don't have that type of capital. We don't have that kind of investment. And so it is about power, it is about money, it's about relationships, and it's also about people sticking their neck out for what's right and for what really should be an obvious thing is to use the power that you have to stop the substation, to call the secretary, to call the governor, to call every single member of the Energy Facility Siting Board. So that's, I would say that I'll close with saying, I think that's sort of the biggest challenge is power and money, which is, just two little things, small details.
Thank you, Maria Belen. I guess going off of something that you brought up in terms of like classifying EJ, I think when I started learning about that and how they basically collect census data in order to classify communities as environmental justice communities, the classifications are like astoundingly just minority based, just based on race, the language that you speak. Like if the community has 25% or more where a member doesn't speak English, they're like called an English isolated community. They are essentially put under like an EJ community, and that's on their state website. And you can download. This is where like my work as a student in mapping this and taking the data and mapping across different counties. So 3 counties: Suffolk, and Middlesex counties, and figuring out like basically what was the access to recreational natural resources and farmers markets. And in essence, not only like are these EJ communities impacted by these, I guess like refineries, incinerators, all of these, I want to say like all of these polluting industries, but also their access to like parks, to farmers markets, to bodies of water, to bike trails, are severely limited. So in my research under like EJ communities, we found that there was a significant drastically different access when you're looking at majority elderly and white communities versus like younger minority communities, so like Black and Hispanics in Massachusetts in those 3 counties. And so I guess seeing that work really led me, like when I was younger, to want to incorporate these aspects into my climate activism. I think there was another thing I wanted to touch on. Yeah, and so I guess the question that you said was right now, like the key challenges in this work, right? So for me, I think in general, as just a climate activism that has kind of like gone here and there because I don't have like a rooted home, right? Like Massachusetts isn't my rooted home, but when I was a student, it was. And so I tried my best to be involved. Now I'm moving to California. I'm here, and this is like going to be my new rooted home until I go to law school, wherever that is. But basically, like you have to bring these, like, I guess, in essence, I want to say like these are challenges that we have to face in this work, right? And for me, it's, I think, like you said, accountability and greenwashing, or the tokenization of our environmental justice communities. So I think like empowering the visibility of Black women and Indigenous leaders in the climate movement, showing the increased representation within the climate action plans that each state has. I think another challenge that we have to face is like the government devotion of resources towards rebuilding the trust between the public and the government. Like, as you've mentioned a lot, like Reverend Mariama, like these processes take a long time. Even with COVID, like it's grueling, and you have to sit there like for hours at these hearings and these meetings, and you have to really push, and sometimes nothing even happens. But you gotta keep working. And so like we have to shift away from the dependence on this government action that is faulty most of the time, or just lacking. I think also like when a majority of the environmental movement focuses things on like personal individual changes, and like these individual changes are focused a lot on the relationship that these industries, these huge industries like plastic, like the gas industry, have on our lives. Like, well, a lot of the times most of us are just trying to survive, to make a livelihood. How are we able to like determine a new relationship with the environment when the things and the forces that are driving us are so ingrained in our society, right? How do we like get out of that? But like, I guess stop shaming individual changes when the majority comes from like inadequate regulations or these industrial companies and mega corporations. And then that thing about, I think a challenge is like we need to focus on reinvesting in our community funds. So I know there's a project called the pilot program, and it's basically trying to get universities to give their money back to the communities, because there's a tax. Like the basis of this program is that the universities, they essentially are like BU is considered, I think I want to say like a non-profit, or the way that they pay taxes is based on a non-profit. So the land that they own and the buildings are assessed on property taxes from 2008, which were pretty low. And now they want to go forward with like, they want to basically BU, yeah, payment in lieu of taxes. Thanks, Nathan. So the fact is that like these universities didn't pay their property taxes, and a lot of the times they were assessed on 2008 property values. And because of that, there was a lot of money that they didn't pay in taxes, that the community had to pay in property taxes, which people thought was unfair. Like BU was running, and Harvard and MIT are running as huge corporate institutions. There are educational institutions, but all of the money that they accumulate, that they have with programs and partnerships with other companies, like they're lucky to be regarded as a nonprofit and essentially not having to pay these taxes. So Pilot is just saying, hey, can you give the community the money that you didn't pay in lieu of the taxes? And so that's where I think, the challenge of reinvesting in our community funds and ventures, while understanding that like small or big companies have to be involved and they can't be left behind. Then against tackling, acknowledging white-centric view of environmentalism. And I guess to say that like this is a process that you have to overcome daily, right? There's a lot of learning and unlearning that everybody has to do, and constantly teaching this work, like to whom you come across, whomever. It's great to be like an inner teacher, I guess, like always be thinking about this and open and receptive to it, and for those who will be also as well. So I believe that social action and community work will accomplish tackling these obstacles towards a just transition, which is what we need. Oh yeah, and then one other interesting project that I worked with was EPA data, so like air quality monitoring report. So the EPA collects a lot of air quality data, right? They basically put these machines in busy areas. And where there's a lot of traffic, and they basically try to, well, they don't try to, they get like air quality data. So upon my assessment through statistics and whatnot, I found that throughout the day, I looked at the 405 freeway, right? 405 freeway is one of the largest freeways in California. It's huge. And so in one area of the city of LA, that the 405 crosses through, I wanted to look at the pollution, and I guess you would think that there's a lot of pollution there from cars, right? Like nitrogen oxides and whatnot that didn't, I guess, move and contributed to ozone, because we have a big ozone problem here. And so what I found that was interesting is that no, actually, freeways are not as, the stuff that they pollute moves. So the way that the chemistry in the air works, it just kind of, it is combusted into the air, and now we have catalytic converters that has decreased it, but it's still a lot. But the way that the chemistry moves is that because there's so much being burned in the freeways, that just the catalyst reaction in the air kind of just moves it away towards the suburbs where it has time to relocate and drift down, right? And so that's why not only are our suburbs or like our EJ communities impacted by these industrial companies, by the lack of natural resources, but also like through our transportation system. Because it's not really the communities that are right next door, even though those are so affected by these freeways. It's like the entire surrounding population. Wherever the wind goes, even it drops, and it's just yeah. I didn't really think of that. That was an interesting way that air chemistry works, and I think that a key challenge in the work is like figuring that out, and talking to people who make the rules, the legislature, like, you know, like providing this data and talking to more scientists about it. So I hope to get involved in that. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you to all three of you. I think that what we're going to do now is move into audience questions. And I'm thinking that a good idea might be, just because we are running low on time, is to have one panelist answer each of the audience questions, if that works for you guys. So we'll just direct it to whoever feels like they really want to answer this question. So the first one says, we know that COVID-19 has hit minority communities the hardest, and we also know that the effects of the climate crisis hit minority communities the hardest. COVID-19 is also impacting the environment. More single-use plastics to avoid shared surfaces, gloves and masks washing up in the oceans, etc. But we don't yet know the full extent. What can or should be done to mitigate the double impact of these dual crises on minority communities?
You want me to take it, or do you? Okay.
I would love for you to take that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the reality is there are lots of things. So I'm part of a co-chair of a group called Renew New England, which brings together the 6 New England states. And we are looking at the double impacts of COVID in 6 areas: food, transportation, public health, food and water and air. What am I missing? Energy and housing. We believe that all of these were already part of the environmental crisis and have been, you know, doubly impacted by COVID. So I think the truth is that the impacts are wide, and you're never going to be able to like grasp all of them at the same time. So the question is, where do you want to lean in and figure out how to see those dual impacts and then think creatively about how to impact it. So that food program that I mentioned, the only reason we have a really good chance of getting that funded right now is because food security has gotten crystal clear to people because of COVID. And so what we said is, how could we address food security in a way that actually makes us more food secure, not just for COVID, but in the long term? How could we address food security in a way that actually strengthens public health, instead of people giving people like boxes of mac and cheese that is not going to help anybody be stronger or healthier or safer? So I think, you know, COVID is so massive, it's impacting everything. And the same is true for climate. And you want to be careful about getting to the point where it's so you want to bring things together and not get so overwhelmed that you're not clear where to have an impact. So I know, like, for instance, people who are organizing around transit, the MBTA was already in debt. It is now massively in debt because every time we rode and we paid into it, it was using that to pay things off. We probably need a radical restructuring of our transit. And so there's a bunch of people working on that right now and making sure that that radical restructuring isn't basically cutting service to the people who need it the most, which is what is about to happen right now. What is a different approach? How do we approach both of these crises in a way that is good long-term thinking, and on the other side, we're stronger? And I think within that, you have to ask the question, who is most impacted? Because usually the same people are most impacted by both. And so if you center the people who are usually left out, you're gonna come up with solutions that both address the COVID impacts and address the climate crisis in an equitable way. I did just email to someone the GJC equity tool that we use. I was just trying to like look at it. I was like, how would we use that in a COVID sense? But there's a lot of really good organizing. There's a Thrive agenda that you can find online. Lots of people are really actually thinking about these intersecting crises. There are some things I just want to note, like on the plastics tip, that are just hard. Like, I completely agree that we should not like just throw away plastic gloves. But right now, I would prefer that you not reuse them on me. Like, we do need to figure out this pandemic. So how do we figure out, there are things that are heartbreaking in terms of how things are getting down, but there are other opportunities we can lean into that have no negative health impacts and could lower our footprint. I think we want to lean into those things, because telling people like, reuse your PPE, that's probably not like a good thing to be telling folks right now, because it will kill people if we are not careful. But if you could come up with a really awesome green PPE, that would be great. But I think there's so many opportunities to impact things that are not going to have negative health impacts, that we should start there before we tackle things like, how many extra plastic gloves we're using at this time.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So I know that Amy had a question regarding environmentalism as a movement and its potential inaccessibility. So Amy, if you want to unmute and ask that. And then right before she does, I just wanted to say that we do have time for a few more questions. So if anyone has any, throw them in the chat. We do have a few that we compiled beforehand, and I have probably a million. So there is no shortage of questions, but there is a shortage of time. But if you guys have any, throw them in the chat and we will ask them next.
Hi, yes, thanks, Keely. Part of my question has already been answered. I've really enjoyed the discussion we've had so far. Thank you guys so much. But I just had a quick question, because I've noticed, as well as what has been pointed out earlier, the separation within the environmental movement, where people are always asking how we get people to care, how we push environmental issues, and there's not enough talk about how to merge environmental issues with economic issues, health issues, social issues, when, as we've talked about today, they're all essentially interconnected. And a lot of times there's gatekeeping of environmental issues. A lot of times people like to commercialize environmental issues, make it trendy. People think, using reusable straws can stop climate change, and that's not true. But I think a lot of times, I was just wondering what everyone's perspective was on just how to unify the environmental movement and continue working to make sure the environmental movement is integrated into policy rather than an afterthought and like a bonus point for social policy.
Bridget, do you want to take it, or do you want me to take it?
You can take it. I was just essentially going to say like how, just very quickly, how like that brought me to the idea of how Reverend Mariama brought up that there was like a whole plethora of individuals coming together for this one coalition and this one issue. In terms of, you were talking about I want to say it was like, oh, the foster care to prison pipeline, right? So how can we train individuals to enter an industry, and then that brings the whole thing in like full circle. There's basically like a people to, honestly, it's like a cycle, right? I forget. But I really support that idea of bringing all these powerful and creative individuals, helping them achieve their best and through these
Yeah, I think what I would say is there are a lot of divisions. There are a lot of deep divisions between the environmental movement and even within the environmental and the environmental justice movement. There's been a lot of hurt. There's been a lot of lack of trust. I mean, I'll be honest, we're not always trusting of large, big environmental groups that come to Chelsea and are like, hey, let's save the trees. Or, hey, what about that Chelsea Creek? What are you doing about the creek? Or what are you doing about your parks? Because at the end of the day, the focus is not the people that are the most impacted, but the focus and the priorities are defined by them, and they're not defined by the folks that are most impacted. So yes, I agree with you. There are big divisions, and I think, like Reverend Mariama was saying, the way we break those divisions is, I think we have to break the silos between the issues, first of all, between the economic and race and environment and labor, and even within our environmental justice movement, the work that we do around transit and food and air quality and public health. At times we see them as separate, and they're not. They're all connected. So I think that, folks can, from an individual level, it's interesting because your comment about the plastic straws, there's a lot of styrofoam used in Chelsea in restaurants for takeout, and there's a lot of judgment around that. And there's a lot of judgment around the sort of the materials that people use when they can't buy the reusable glass containers, when they can't buy the sort of the environmentally friendly, when they can't compost, when they can't do all of these things that it would be great if we did. And another example is electrical vehicles. We would love to have electrical vehicles, but we can't afford them. And so because we can't afford them, we're not going to support legislation that will fund electrical vehicles when that money can be going into public transit, into electrifying public transit fleets. There is no way that we're going to support the Transportation Climate Initiative, right? This is a multi-state regional initiative from Virginia all the way to Canada that is supposed to reduce emissions in the transportation sector. But where is that going? Sort of the direction that that's moving, or that we fear it's moving, is in electrical vehicles. So we're going to electrify the grid so that rich people can get more electrical vehicles. We don't even own cars. Folks in Chelsea, the majority of people in Chelsea do not own a car. We rely on public transit. So we need whatever revenue comes from that initiative to go 100% into the public transit system. And that is even if we even support the initiative, because the initiative has a whole lot of assumptions about the siting of infrastructure that has not been analyzed. So where is all that infrastructure going to go? So so what I'm saying is that there are a lot of divisions, and this is one example. The Transportation Climate Initiative is one example of that division of the environmental sector and the environmental justice sector, because we're saying, hold on a second, don't move ahead with this policy so fast because it sounds good, when we don't know that the people that are already most impacted won't be further impacted from the concentration of pollution, and won't be further impacted from not having access to these electrical vehicles and having to pay for higher fares. Reverend Mariama was talking about public transit. They are cutting service right now. And this is another action item that you can all take. Attend the Fiscal and Management Control Board of the MBTA on Monday, and then the next Monday, and then the next Monday, to say there should be no cuts, absolutely no cuts. And yes, I understand the MBTA is in a horrible position. I would not want to work at the MBTA right now, but they need to work together with the legislators. Secretary Pollack can work together with the governor, who can work together with Speaker DeLeo, who can work together with the legislators. When they want to work together, they can. And so if it's about funding public transit, they have to fund public transit. Chelsea has the highest infection rates. A lot of our folks take public transit. 80% of our workforce were essential employees. How do you think they got infected? Because they were all crammed on public transit, then came home, lived in crowded housing because of the high cost of rent. So you cannot now, in the middle of the pandemic, cut public transit, even for the lines that you say are non-essential, because then it's just going to create more crowdedness. So all of these issues are connected, the air quality with transit, the transit with public health. And so, yes, there are a lot of divisions. And I think what Reverend Mariama was saying is that we break those silos and then we break those divisions, that all of these issues are connected. And we develop trust between these large environmental groups and the grassroots environmental justice, social justice, economic justice groups that are working on the ground with the folks most impacted. I have to say, I've been really impressed with our environmental allies at the environmental justice legislative table that has been rooted in community. And so they've been really respectful of the decisions that we've made at the table because it's been anchored by green roots and neighbor to neighbor. So we have to develop trust and we have to be able to call on them and say, we need you and we need you to stick your neck out for us because we keep doing it for year after year after year, generation after generation. And it needs to be the people who have more privilege, that have more power to speak out for us. And I think, Reverend Mariama, you wanted to say something.
No, I just wanted to just point out that trust is earned because people show up and like, hi, I'm here and I'm happy and I'm like ready to help. Trust me. And, you know, you do want to recognize that people have been screwed over like lots and lots of times. And you may have to put in a little bit more work and wait a little while for people to trust you because, yeah. You know, and I do want to also just quick note is like, recognize that if you aren't going to be in it for the long haul, that's okay. You're students. You need to follow the leadership of people who are going to be in it for the long haul. And I see sometimes people showing up like, I want to lead something. I know I'm only going to be here for like 5 weeks, you know, like, but it's just like, follow the lead of folks who are going to stay in it for 5 years. You can contribute. But it doesn't make sense for you to be centered. You should be an ally, a supporter, because you can't stay the whole time. Bring good, powerful energy, but follow the lead of people who've already been in it and will be able to stay in it. That's what's going to be much more effective.
And maybe you'll stay in it for years, but when you've been in there for years, then you can take more of a leadership role with the folks on the ground. I think that's also important that there are people that get in the work and really commit their entire lives to this work. And that's really admirable and important, but you really have to put in the work. The other, I know we are almost out of time. The one thing I was going to say about trust and process is, like Reverend Mariama said, it takes time to build consensus, to take the community's perspective into consideration, into shaping things from the very beginning until the very end. You can't come into communities like Chelsea and East Boston, ask us to sign on to something, rubber stamp it, and move on, because we will say, no, oh yeah, when did you start developing this initiative or policy or legislation? Because we weren't involved from the very beginning. So it takes time, it takes commitment, and it moves a lot slower because it's more holistic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think that's really meaningful to hear for the young people and the college students on the call who want to get involved. It's important to consider that the movement is not about you yourself getting involved in something. It's not something for your resume. It's something that is people's lives. It's their everyday. So I had one question personally for Reverend Mariama, and then we have, I just wanted to ask one more, and then we have a closer, but that's it, I swear, guys. My question for you, Reverend Mariama, was how does your faith affect your views on these things? There are those who see Christianity or religion in general and environmentalism as mutually exclusive. They kind of see, like in the Bible, talking about subduing the land, and they see that as sort of a mandate to conquer or destroy, as opposed to a command for stewardship. And yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
So I remind people, at least from and you know, I do a lot of interfaith work, but I'll talk specifically from my own tradition because my own tradition is one of the more problematic. You know, our very, very first scripture is a love letter from God to all of God's creation. And that creation unfolds over 6 days. And we are the last thing on the sixth day. It talks about the sun and the moon, the stars, the water, all the animals. And we are the last thing, like maybe the last whatever, some portion of whatever that last sixth day is. The notion that we are therefore allowed to sort of lord over everything else doesn't make any sense. Because if it was really all about us, then the rest of everything else would be squeezed into one day and we'd be the next 5 days. But that is not what it is. It says that each thing was good. And it also says that we have a relationship with the earth in the same way that God has a relationship with us. Now, that does matter what you think about who God is and how your relationship with God is. But from my understanding, God is extremely patient because humans are a hot mess. They don't listen. You be trying to tell them stuff. They go off and act a fool. And then they're like, why is this happening to me? And it's like, I told you that 17 chapters ago, but apparently you had to like do all that stuff and get into trouble before you got it, right? And so I think that like the notion, our relationship, even if you think that our relationship is one of being over the earth, it's still over the earth in the same way that God would be over humans in a really loving way, in a patient, in a like restorative, in a like a relationship that is built on deep love and hope for the absolute best to be possible. So I actually do not use the word dominating, and I think I could talk at some other point if anybody's interested about the Hebrew translation of that word and why I think, you know, there has been a mistranslation of that word. But I think at the foundation is the recognition that if it was supposed to be all about us, then that love poem would have been all about us, and it wasn't. and the relationship is not one in which we violate other things, because God also made our bodies to need all the rest of those things. We need light and we need dark and we need water and we need, you know, we are interdependent with the rest of creation. And one of the things I remind people, especially for the, you know, I love the Bible and study the Bible and teach from the Bible. But before it was written down, we had the example of nature and of the creation. The creation is God's first testament, period. And if we were supposed to have these kinds of abusive relationships, why would our body be so interdependent with the rest of the creation? That just doesn't make any sense. So, you know, I try to reframe our conversation because I think the way the conversation has been had is extremely toxic. And I quite frankly think a lot of it is read through American Christianity, which is deeply ensconced in white supremacy. And so for me, I see it very differently because I come out of a Black tradition that says God cares most deeply for those who others overlook. That is the central notion. The story of the Good Samaritan and of the fact that Jesus says your neighbor is the person beaten up on the side of the road. I will judge you by your relationship with them. And so how it becomes okay to such deep violations of all the other species, of the water, of the land, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't hold together theologically. And so I do spend some of my energy pushing people in my own tradition, because you're not going to out-Bible me. You go there, I'll go there. We'll go there together. And I trust me on the other side. I don't think you'll be able to hold the same notion that we should be out here fracking. There's no God-given right to fracking. You know, let's talk about it. That is not in there. And I'm going to push back on anybody that tries to mix these exploitative capitalistic ways of thinking with the text, because it's just not in there. You could do it, but don't try to say my God told you to do that. Do what you want to do, but you ain't putting that on God.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so wow, thank you all so much for taking the time to sit with us today to think about these issues. It means so much to me personally that so many people are willing to take the time out of their day to just think about these things. And I encourage you to keep thinking about them and keep thinking about how you yourself can have an impact, how you can get involved in a way that's not stepping on people's toes who actually do that work. So yeah, we appreciate you, our speakers, and the work that you're doing in your communities. It is just so important, and we just want to make sure that we are continuing to build up the work that you do and to support what you guys are doing. I want to give each of the speakers a moment to just plug anything they want to plug. Let us know if there's anything you didn't get a chance to talk about that you would like to, and then that will be it.
I guess I just wanted to support what Mariam and Belen were saying about how that that people need to wake up and get involved. So I think that I want people to know that the work isn't easy, but it's necessary. You can find your niche of environmental justice in whatever field of work, as long as your mindset is consistent in putting first, your values of environmental justice. I think that throughout my experience and what you've heard so far, that people power is real. That we can't do anything unless we come together, no matter whatever our background is. We need to use our personal skills to do what we do best, whatever that is, and build a community that uplifts themselves in the face of environmental injustice. You can get involved through anything, local org, community hearings, petitions, some research. There's a lot of public data. Figuring out your own environmental community, like, wherever you go, make sure you know the leaders and get involved. Community activists, there's like online campaigns, they're so easy to start. Social media infographics, there's like a huge social media burst of like local activists, young activists too, trying to get information out. And so that's who we need to support on the ground. So I'm really happy. And I hope everybody's safe and taken care. Thank you for having me.
I can go next. I'll say 3 things. Go on the MBTA and go on Monday and every other Monday after that and tell them to stop the cuts. At least to not rush into any cuts, because we know that any cuts will be permanent, even if they say they won't. Once you cut a line, it's going to take years to bring it back. The other thing will be is suggestion to call the secretary. That's our sort of request from allies, is call Secretary Kathleen Theoharides, Climate Katie at Twitter, if you want to tweet at her, and ask her to postpone the hearing. And also ask her to reopen the question of need. Is this substation really needed? Or is this going to really just be a return on investment for Eversource shareholders? They're not willing, they haven't released the data. So we want the EFSB, the Energy Facility Siting Board, to reopen the question of need. And then the third and last thing is call your legislators and tell them that you support environmental justice legislation. Even if you don't live in the district of the conference committee members, just call them and say, we support environmental justice legislation. The more that people hear about it, the more that environmental justice is going to be in the consciousness of people. So testify against the MBTA cuts, ask the secretary to postpone the hearing, call your legislators about environmental justice legislation. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I already got to speak again, so just thankful to be here, and I hope you all will continue to stay in this. We are all trying to save ourselves, so we're in this together, and look forward to continuing to engage with you.
Thanks so much for coming, guys. It means the world to us that you all came out. If we could, before we go, get one more round of applause for our speakers and also for Keely for doing an amazing job moderating.
And David for doing so much in the planning process. Yeah, thank you all so much. I'm going to let you all go. I know that you all stayed late, and I really appreciate it. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Be safe, be healthy, be happy.
Thanks again, guys.
See ya.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.